Susan Judkins is president of Watershed Management Authorities of Iowa. She helped to shepherd passage of the original legislation for WMAs in 2010 on behalf of the Rebuild Iowa office. She coordinated establishment of one of the first WMAs, the Upper Cedar Watershed Management Authority, in 2012, and currently represents the City of Clive on the Walnut Creek Watershed Management Authority and North Raccoon River Watershed Management Coalition. Susan is Client Development Director for RDG Planning and Design, a design firm whose services include water resources initiatives, including planning and engineering. She is a council member for the City of Clive. Today she'll be presenting on lessons learned in 10 years of watershed management authorities in Iowa. So as I was saying prior to getting Susan on, we have one previous webinar, the Chris Jones webinar. We're hoping to get the video of that up once we have a couple of other videos in place that have better audio quality. We didn't want our first uploaded webinar video to be one with kind of nasty audio quality. So we're working on getting that done by recording this webinar. In addition, we have the summer conference, the 75th SWCS International Annual Conference that is going all online, and that is going to be a virtual event mostly held via Zoom, we believe. The announcement for that will be coming out within the next few days, if not tomorrow, and the dates on that are July 27th through 29th. So that will be a great event to get some more of this kind of soil conservation information out. And most of our presenters that were planning to attend the in-person conference have agreed to move to an online conference. So that is great news. So it'll be a really good conference, kind of dealing with our new normal with the pandemic. So it'll be an interesting experience, but I think it'll be really good. Members of the Iowa chapter and all chapters of SWCS, if you're from another state, are able to be registered for $75, and then non-member rate is $99. So look for an opportunity to become a member with your registration and save a little money that way too. Plus, get the great benefits of being a member of our society, including our publication, regular newsletters, access to these webinars, obviously, and some other perks and things. So you'll hear more information about that coming out real soon. All right, so that's pretty much it for administrative things. I do have one wrap-up item after the question and answer period that I'll come back for, but otherwise we're going to turn it over to Susan. And all attendees, remember there is a chat function to submit Q&A. Feel free to do so all throughout the presentation as you're thinking of questions, and we will get to those at the end.
Well, thanks everyone for bearing with us. I was having a little bit of trouble signing in using my email address, but I think we're good now. So when Steve reached out recently to see if we would be willing to kind of do an update for members of your organization on watershed management authorities, I really welcomed the chance to do it. And it seemed kind of ironic to me to think back over the past 10 years and how watershed management authorities were really born out of a pretty traumatic time we were going through at that time, much like it feels like we're going through now with the pandemic underway. So decided to kind of focus on lessons learned over the past 10 years and, be very happy to talk about things going forward too. But we'll start with this photo, which shows the Cedar Rapids flooding that was occurring back in 2008. And at that time, I was working with a firm called Piper Jaffray. And I had been recruited to join them to support municipal bonding in the state of Iowa, because prior to that, I had been working with the Iowa League of Cities in a government relations capacity. And they thought that my connections with cities would be relevant to promoting work with them. So I was actually having a meeting in Ely, not too far from Cedar Rapids, in June, and we were becoming more and more aware of the rising waters in the Cedar River. And I can remember driving along 380 with the intention to go to my hometown of Vinton, which is upstream of the Cedar from Cedar Rapids, and seeing this kind of a scene from my car. In fact, I was one of the last ones over the bridge on 380 before they had to close it on my way to Vinton. And this was pretty much the scene I found when I reached my hometown. You can see the courthouse there in the foreground. The waters had basically inundated the former jail site just to the north there, and access to the bridge over the Cedar was completely cut off from the community. So that was kind of my initial snapshot view of what became an 85 county disaster area declared for the state of Iowa. And then Governor Culver decided to convene a group, the Rebuild Iowa Advisory Commission, to focus on recommendations to help the state be more resilient in the face of future weather disasters. And the Rebuild Iowa Advisory Commission worked during the fall and into the winter of the 2008-2009 timeframe to come up with recommendations. In the meantime, our country suffered a significant financial impact. Everybody thinking back to 2008 can remember the financial fallout that happened that fall. And I ended up being part of a national reduction in force at Piper Jaffray in December of 2008. And very happily was quickly invited to join the Rebuild Iowa office in the capacity of Intergovernmental Affairs Director. And this slide shows some of those of us who were part of that effort. You can see General Ron Dardis there at the left. He is meeting with members of the Rebuild Iowa Advisory Commission who represented communities and various expertise from throughout the state of Iowa. And you can see me in my tan capris standing with other members of the Rebuild Iowa office. We had a little get together shortly after the office closed as planned in 2011. But between the time of my joining the Rebuild Iowa office, right before the legislature convened in January of 2009, and until that office closed in 2011, we did manage to accomplish a few things that set the stage for work by watershed management authorities moving forward. So the Rebuild Iowa Advisory Committee or Commission ended up having 12 recommendations overall. And my job was to help carry those recommendations to the legislature, not just by myself, but partnering with many others from the communities and from other stakeholder organizations to work with legislators to truly help achieve that goal of making Iowa more resilient in the face of future disasters. Recommendation number 9, specifically related to floodplain management. And it coordinated with recommendation number 8, which related to planning, not just in floodplains, but and communities in general, and recommendation number 10, which basically outlined a recommendation that we have better flood mapping for the entire state. But recommendation number 9, which said that the state will move state policy forward and lead the discussion with regional and local interests on floodplain and watershed management, ended up being incorporated to a bill known as House File 756 that was considered by the legislature in 2009. And one of the things they did was to require a brand new organization that had been formed in 2008, specifically to look at water quality issues, called the Water Resources Coordinating Council, added flooding to their purview and asked that they provide funding recommendations that would promote a watershed management approach to reduce the adverse impact of future flooding on the state's residents, businesses, communities, and soil and water quality. So, one of the specific ideas that evolved from that was to focus on a more regional approach to watershed management. You know, there was definitely recognition that all of our soil and water conservation districts across the state provide a very, very valuable service. And, you know, I want to underscore that from the time the Watershed Management Authority idea was being promoted, there was always recommendation that the SWCDs had provided a valuable role and would continue to do that. But there was also a recognition that those are, you know, basically in kind of 99 boxes around the state that don't follow floodplain boundaries. So it was identified that a watershed management authority would be formed by 2 or more cities, counties, and or soil and water conservation districts under an intergovernmental or Chapter 2080 agreement within an 8-digit hydrologic unit code, or HUC-8 watershed. And specific activities were outlined, including to assess and reduce flood risk, assess and improve water quality, monitor federal flood risk activities, educate residents, and allocate funding made available to the authority for purposes of water quality and flood mitigation. From the beginning, there was a decision to not give watershed management authorities any taxing ability at all. It was specifically worded so that funding would come, if it came at all, from other sources, but that the WMA would be able to allocate that funding specifically for purposes of water quality and flood mitigation. And pictured here, you see the Walnut Creek watershed, and that's the watershed that I live in. And you heard Steve mention that I now represent the City of Clive on both the Walnut Creek Watershed Management Authority and the North Raccoon. I'm a member of the Clive City Council, and since joining the council in 2013 and their knowledge about my prior work with the Rebuild Iowa office, it seemed like a natural fit that I would continue working with watershed management authorities. It's worth taking some time to look at this floodplain map of the state of Iowa. Most of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with it. This shows the various watersheds that we have in the state. And we now have about a third of Iowa's geographic area comprised within a watershed management authority. And we'll take a look at those where those exist today in a moment. So that legislation passed in 2009 initially to have the Water Resources Coordinating Council come forward with recommendations. In 2010, those recommendations came forward, and that spring we saw the language outlining what a watershed management authority would entail. We saw language that provided for establishment of Iowa's Iowa Floodplain and Stormwater Management Association. We saw a recommendation for pilot projects to be undertaken. And we saw, there's a fourth one. Basically watershed education. So those were 4 of the Water Resources Coordinating Council's 25 or so recommendations that actually went into the Iowa Code. And we were pleased to get those things accomplished. I've told many of you before that in many ways I ended up being criticized by other lobbyists for implementing some of that language without having any funding attached to it, because there was a sense that legislators would feel like they had done something, but without any funding to actually carry it out, it would be difficult to, ever make progress. But I reminded everyone that the Rebuild Iowa office would only be in place until 2011, that we didn't have a lot of time to wait for financial situations to improve in the state to be able to have finances attached to the legislation. If you can recall, I mentioned the financial disaster that we'd had on top of the flooding disaster in 2008, and recovery from that took a significant period of time. And in 2010, we were seeing across the board cuts having to be undertaken in the state. It just wasn't a good time to be allocating funding, even though legislators remained convinced that we did need to take steps to be more resilient moving forward. So I was very pleased that they passed those 4 items, and it resulted in the opportunity to utilize disaster funding that was kind of a supplement that came into the state in the summer of 2010. Department of Housing and Urban Development announced that with additional disaster funding of $84 million coming to the state, gave us an opportunity to consider in Iowa how that would be spent. And General Dardis felt that it was very important to allocate a portion of that to watershed work. And so state leaders agreed that $10 million would be carved out for watershed initiatives. And that opportunity then went behind the WRCC recommendations that had passed. So of that, we had $800,000 that was dedicated to the Iowa Department of Natural Resources for coordination of organizing watershed management authorities. And, as we indicated before, the types of things that could be considered for that WMA that would be within a Huckgate watershed would be to assess and reduce flood risk, to work on assessing and improving water quality, monitoring federal flood risk planning and activities, educating residents about flood risks and water quality, and allocating funds. So upon the closure of the Rebuild Iowa office as planned the next year in 2011, I ended up joining a an engineering firm, and in that role had the real pleasure to work with the Upper Cedar area watershed in implementing one of the first 6 watershed management authorities that ended up being formed under that legislation, and using some of the disaster funding that had been set aside to support organizing watershed management authorities. The first 6 included the Catfish Creek WMA, which is based out of Dubuque, the Indian Creek Watershed Management Authority, based out of Lynn County, the Middle South Raccoon, which is kind of the southern part of the Raccoon watershed, kind of from the Des Moines area on down to the southeast. Squaw Creek Watershed Management Authority in Story County, primarily. The Turkey River Watershed Management Authority in northeast Iowa, and the Upper Cedar Watershed Management Improvement Authority. It was really interesting to kind of follow the establishment of each of these 6 because they kind of took different approaches. Some were led by local Resource Conservation and Development, or RC&D office. That's the example of the Turkey River. Some were led by a council of government, and that was definitely the case in Indian Creek. Squaw Creek was really led by a county office, and on and on. The Upper Cedar that I helped with ended up really being initially promoted by a former state legislator who had become a Floyd County supervisor by the name of Mark Hewen. And he saw the value of a watershed management authority and worked hard to promote establishment of that in that area. As hoped, establishing these 6 watershed management authorities started to generate real attention from other parts of the state. And thanks to just really tremendous support by the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and I give great credit to Alan Benini for his strong belief in wanting to see more watershed management authorities come together. We did start to see that happen. And really through his leadership, we saw not only establishment of watershed management authorities, but also a focus on preparing watershed plans as a follow-up to that initial work. So here we show what the coverage is today of Iowa's watershed management authorities. There are 26 that have been established. We definitely see coverage in some of the very critical areas of the state. Every part of the state is critical. Don't get me wrong about that. But we've seen some of the really significant damage coming in some of our more populated areas. And so kind of along that northeast corridor, you find a lot of Iowa's population, and then we see some others that are kind of contributing to that central Iowa population base as well. In recent years, we've seen significant flooding impacts along the Missouri River and the Mississippi River. So those are areas where it would be really great to see more watershed management authority activity. So some of the benefits that have started to be identified from establishing a watershed management authority include the planning on a watershed scale. That was seen from the beginning as something that was important to get outside of county boundaries, which for water purposes end up being kind of arbitrary, to foster multi-jurisdictional partnership and cooperation. So as initially outlined, cities, counties, and soil and water conservation districts have been invited to participate. That's been expanded a little bit to include, for example, benefited water districts. And by no means is this intended to exclude other stakeholders from participating in the conversations at the meetings that are held by watershed management authorities. And those that are functioning well very often have other stakeholders participating. The other benefits include leveraging resources such as funding and technical expertise. And it just has to be emphasized that the University of Iowa's IIHR and Iowa Flood Center have been a primary source of funding in terms of their willingness to get involved in bringing resources into the state from federal sources and others. And definitely their technical expertise has just proven to be almost incalculable in terms of value. So for those of you who heard from Chris Jones' presentation, I guess a few weeks ago, he is part of the Iowa Flood Center. It's an example of some of the information that's brought to the WMAs for consideration and focus. And then another benefit ends up being facilitating stakeholder involvement in the Watershed Management Authority. So when the Rebuild Iowa office closed as planned back in 2011, there had been a really great amount of planning and resource development that had been pulled together to try to achieve what the Rebuild Iowa Advisory Commission had envisioned in wanting to help the state be more resilient in the face of future disasters. A lot of that material is housed in the archives that the state maintains at the state library. But the one place that some of it is accessible online right now is through the University of Iowa's Urban Planning Department. They found that the work that had been kind of managed through the Rebuild Iowa office represented an excellent study in planning initiatives. And so they offered to house that information. And I highly encourage anyone who is interested in seeing more of the background about how all of this came together to take a look at these websites that are referenced here. For example, I made reference earlier to the work that the Water Resources Coordinating Council did in promoting some of their floodplain management recommendations. That was a year-long process that began in the summer of 2009. There were 4 subcommittees that were formed and led efforts to identify recommendations for upland management and lowland management, and all of these various committee efforts came together and resulted in the 25 recommendations that I mentioned earlier. Among the recommendations are some really good ideas for implementation. And my friend Ray Myler, who runs the Cherry Glen Learning Farm near Ankeny, shows an an actual effort to follow the recommendations that came out of that floodplain management exercise and to put it into actual practice on a farm. And Ray would be a great resource for anyone wanting to see some of the recommendations in action. Again, a watershed plan is often a first important step for watershed management authorities. And I have to continue to give great credit to the Department of Natural Resources to their ongoing effort to identify some funding sources to help that planning to occur. It's just has proven to be invaluable. I've got some examples shown here of some of the plans that have happened over the years. And if you visit the Department of Natural Resources website to kind of review what's been happening with watershed management authorities, they list all 26 there. And for all of those that have completed a watershed plan, they've provided the link to see what that planning process has entailed. And I recommend taking a look at those. So after the first WMAs ended up being established starting in 2012, the DNR helped us to convene on an annual basis to share best practices, to start identifying ways we might be able to work together and share good ideas. And by late 2016, it was decided that it would really be beneficial to establish a more formal watershed management authority network. And so we had several meetings. Pat Bodie, who is an excellent facilitator, helped to generate some good discussion over what was desired for that kind of an organization. And by May of 2017, we had an introductory meeting for a new organization, which came to be known as the Watershed Management Authorities of Iowa. We filed for nonprofit status with the state of Iowa in 2018 and received designation as a 501c6 by the IRS in 2019. So for Watershed Management Authorities of Iowa, which is now an official organization, we outlined the purpose and goals, including that Watershed Management Authorities of Iowa was created to enable WMA to WMA exchanges and be an information resource for latest news and research, funding opportunities, and curriculum in watershed restoration. The organization seeks to unite watershed management authorities for further advancement in the state, share resources, ideas, and best practices, provide support to members through technical assistance and celebrating successes, build and support ongoing public-private partnerships for success. And the first board of directors was established in 2017. And we've got a list here of our current board members and then the current officers, which include past president Jim Erb, who's the former mayor of Charles City. I currently serve as president of the organization. I'm a city council member. President-elect Kara Morgan is from Southwest Iowa, and she is with a Resource Conservation and Development organization. Treasurer Bob Rice is an official with Polk County, and Secretary Jennifer Fensel is with the Council of Governments in Cedar Rapids. So we have a good broad base of participation. While the goal of watershed management authorities in terms of planning and coordinating and educating is well underway and has had an impact over the last 8 years since the first 6 WMAs were established. We definitely continue to see ongoing weather disasters, as had been recognized we needed to be preparing for. This photo was one of the devastating photos from 2019, which actually had enough weather impacts that we had 80 counties in Iowa designated as disaster areas, so 4/5 of the state. But Western Iowa and the Missouri River area ended up being heavily impacted. So the work is definitely not done. We continue to look for ways to establish more watershed management authorities, to develop more stakeholder buy-in. It's kind of interesting that our organization continues to function, but we haven't had as much activity over the past year. We do owe great thanks to the Iowa Water Center, housed at Iowa State University, for really being supportive of the organization as it first kind of became a fledgling group. But they had other areas to focus upon and has stepped out of that role a little over 6 months or so ago. And then we've been identifying how to move forward. The organization itself doesn't have money. There's a lot of goodwill and passion to do good, but we don't have funding to pay a facilitator. The executive committee has explored various options, and we are hoping that when we can once again be meeting in person again, to be able to generate some good discussion on how we choose to move forward with that. But at this point, we aren't able to come together for an in-person meeting, and our bylaws actually require that to make a bylaws change or even to move forward with electing new officers, it's supposed to happen at our annual meeting, which our bylaws say will happen in person. So it's probably going to warrant some good conversation for our organization, much like many other groups throughout the state, to identify changes that we may need to make to our own governing documents, let alone how we end up identifying some staff support opportunities based on what we've experienced during this pandemic. So with that, I would say that all of us have reasons that we care a lot about watersheds. And for me, it relates to growing up along the Cedar River in Vinton. And today, living just right on the shore of Country Club Lake in Clive, where I serve the community as a council member and have heard from so many residents in Clive, which is a lovely community built along the Walnut Creek watershed. The trail that follows that creek is a defining element of our city, but along with that has come a lot of flooding impacts, and we've even been experiencing buyouts of areas that were impacted by that flooding. We all care about history. We definitely care about health. We know we can't live without water. Economic development is important to all of us. And at least for me, the number one reason is the future generations that we're preparing for. And you see a picture of my 2 daughters with my little grandchildren. And they're on my top of mind for me all the time. I wanted to list here my contact information, both at RDG and with the City of Clive. Definitely happy to have conversations with anybody at any time to provide, insight into some of what's been experienced over the last 10 years. And now I'm happy to do a little bit of group conversation if there are questions that you'd like to have answered now.
Sure. Yeah, we can turn to Q&A. I am not seeing questions, so if anybody has submitted any, Heidi, you might have to access them through the host interface. But if anybody else would like to submit questions, feel free to start doing that now. There is a send privately button if you want kind of your name to be left out of the conversation for whatever reason. Those would go to the host and I believe Susan directly for answering. Let's see if I can come up with a question real quick. So the Upper Cedar was your first WMA. Have you seen a lot of the other WMAs follow the same method of formation that the Upper Cedar used? Like, was it the same kind of conversations that happened between the Soil and Water Conservation Society? Was it heavily led by Nrcs or anything like that that has kind of echoed itself across the state as more WMAs have formed?
It's a great question. I think there are a lot of similarities and there are also some differences within every watershed management authority, and that's appropriate because it's intended to be local and to respond to some of those local drivers. We've seen the leadership come out of a county, from a city, from an RC&D, from the Council of Governments. It probably doesn't matter as much who starts it as it does matter that everyone feels they're invited in to the conversation. So the law does require that every eligible entity within the district has to be invited to participate, but it can actually be formed with as few as 2 of those entities: cities, counties, soil and water conservation districts, benefited water districts, deciding to go ahead and form. Ideally, you have participation and membership from many, if not most, of those entities within the group. Some of the differences have really related to funding opportunities. So one difference for Upper Cedar has been that they've never had the funding to have a coordinator put in place. A number of the watershed management authorities have had a coordinator, whether it was an RC&D choosing to be the initial leader and then kind of using the water efforts that the WMA undertakes as an opportunity to seek additional grant funding to keep staff support in place, or, for example, with the watershed approach that the Iowa Flood Center has helped to promote, and some of the federal funding that came behind that. Those funds have been utilized to help keep a coordinator in place. So one of the biggest differences, I think, has been those that have managed to have some staff support versus those that are working strictly with volunteers. And it isn't that you can't operate without that staff support. It's just so ideal to have it because of the value of connecting with multiple landowners and others. So I would say in the case of the Upper Cedar, it has truly been reliant on the Soil and Water Conservation District personnel in that area to assist in some of the watershed related activities. And so it's greatly appreciated.
All right, we've got a couple more that came in. Amy Crouch is with the Nature Conservancy based out of Cherokee, I believe. She's working on establishing some watershed management authorities along the Little Sioux River. One
Great.
of the most recent WMAs formed up there was the Little Sioux Headwaters, which encompasses the Iowa Great Lakes lake system. So Amy asks, do you anticipate more funding available for WMAs if/when IWIL gets passed? Planning, implementation, or both?
Well, it's a great question. And we thought we might have a chance to see that this year since there was an effort underway to look at changing Iowa's tax structure that would have included a state sales tax increase, and that then would have begun to fund IWIL. We're hearing that that's not expected at this time. It's pretty hard to look at changing a tax structure when so much is unknown about the status of various resources moving forward. But once IWIL is able to be considered, there really is. I don't want to quite go so far as to say expectation, but I think there's a strong sense that there will be interest in providing some funding because of that value of having coordination happening on a watershed basis, and having some funding to support that would be very, very valuable. I want to give a shout out to Cody Smith, who's with the Center for Rural Affairs. I know he's had some good conversations with the governor's staff and others, and good interest had been expressed to him in at least identifying some good ways for that type of focus to happen moving forward. So we think it's a conversation that will continue to happen.
Great, yeah. Amy had another follow-up. What are the added benefits of WMAs over, say, soil and water conservation districts or NRCS using Eyedolls and farm bill programs? So I'm kind of drawing some meaning out of that, but she's trying to get at how can WMAs potentially use some of the farm bill funding maybe better or in a more structured way than if it was just limited to districts or NRCS guidance?
I would say that those soil and water conservation districts and NRCS efforts remain absolutely critical. What the Watershed Management Authority enables is truly getting outside of those county boundaries and promoting some broader stakeholder engagement. Some of what we've seen has been having cities at the table, definitely provides some value. There is definitely an increasing interest and knowledge being gained from cities that a lot of what they're dealing with as they're working to clean water coming into their entities, if they can be coordinating and collaborating upstream and even providing some resources upstream, that can make their job easier as the water comes into their areas. So there's just a lot of value in supporting people, getting to know each other, to understand mutual benefits and concerns and questions. And that's something that a watershed management authority brings to the table that's really, really valuable, is getting some of those entities that have more typically worked in silos, coordinating and sharing information with each other to do the planning that identifies where the highest impact projects may be able to be implemented for more efficient use of those limited resources that become available to put projects in place.
Great. That is it for the questions that I've seen so far. If you have any others that have popped up that have been sent privately, check your chat box in the WebEx window. And you can probably turn off your screen share at this point as well, which is down at the bottom. And I'll just remind everybody that we've got another webinar coming up next week at the same time slot, same day, with, oh, hey, we got your camera on. Same time slot, same day, with Sarah Carlson of Practical Farmers of Iowa. So she's going to be talking about changing the cover crop message. I don't know quite what that means, but I'm very intrigued, and that's the sign of a good title, right? So I'll be hosting that one as well, and then we will be moving on to having some more maybe regional speakers that will be led by our Soil and Water Conservation Society Iowa chapter regional chairs after that. And so I'm not sure when those will necessarily take place at this time, but we'll be working on scheduling. We're hoping for, kind of to continue to have a footprint each month as we go on here, obviously taking a bit of a break for the SWCS annual conference, which once again is July 27th through the 29th, which will be online only. And registration for that, again, is $75 for members, $95 for non-members, and information will be coming out on that very soon with the registration link. Also, you might want to keep an eye on swcs.org. Which will be a good website kind of as a clearinghouse of information on the conference as we approach that date. And with that, I think I'll say my thank yous to Susan for giving us this talk, and also for Heidi for hosting it and dealing with the mess there. We got one last question in from Lori Scoville. Oh, she says thank you. Sorry, no question, but thanks, Susan. If you want to leave with any parting thoughts, we'll close down the webinar from there and get the recording up as soon as we can.
I'd just like to thank you, Steve, and all of your members and others who took the time to attend today. I hope all of you share my passion for watershed improvement, and just really want to give you credit for pulling this kind of collaborative discussion together, and hope we can find meaningful ways to work together moving forward.
Definitely. I think your message of WMAs blending a lot of viewpoints from all kinds of diverse stakeholders is super important to their viability long term, and it's proven to be one of the best benefits of the WMA structure that we've seen so far. So thank you again, and hope to see many of you that are participating next week for our talk with Sarah Carlson. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.